today's video is going to be rather lengthy, so I have just not one, but two things that I want to quickly mention before we get into it. The first is that I am a little bit under the weather. Just a little bit under the weather. You might be able to tell, and that's why I'm letting you know. It's possible that my voice sounds a little bit different, and you might be questioning why, or a little bit confused by the sound. So I'm letting you know that I have a bit of a nose and throat thing going on at the moment. I'm hoping it's not distracting or bothersome in any way, but just wanted to let you know. I'm not sure if you'll pick up on it, and you might see a cough drop at some point later in this video. I'm not sure, but we're gonna figure it out, okay? So thank you for bearing with me on that. The second thing that I want to mention is that I so appreciate you being here. And I know I say this in every video, but I don't think I talk about it quite enough. I really want to say that I do read every single comment that comes my way, okay? And I do try to respond to every comment as well. I know I can be a little bit slow at times, so for that I apologize, but your words make me feel so good. I screenshot so many of the comments that you all leave me, and they just make my whole day and week and month and so on. So I just really want to say thank you for that, because again, I feel like I don't say it enough and I don't accurately express what it means to me. So thank you times a million. Okay, so let's get into this video, because I have so many notes, and you might be wondering or questioning why I chose this particular topic for today, but it's because it's incredibly timely. So let's get into it, okay? It'll make sense in just a moment if it doesn't right now. Okay. The Deepwater Horizon was an ultra-deepwater, dynamically positioned, semi-submersible offshore drilling rig. A mouthful, I know. It was owned by Transocean and operated by British Petroleum, also known as BP. On April 20th, 2010, while drilling at the Macondo Prospect, a blowout caused an explosion on the rig that killed 11 crewmen and injured 17. The incident ignited an inextinguishable fireball visible from 40 miles away. On April 22nd, the Deepwater Horizon oil rig sank, leaving the well gushing at the seabed. This quickly became known as the most devastating oil spill in all of history. So today, just days after the 14-year anniversary of this tragic event, we are going to talk about it, okay? So, just starting with a little bit of background. The Deepwater Horizon was built for R&B Falcon by Hyundai Heavy Industries, located in Ulsan, South Korea. Construction of the rig began in 1998 and was fully built and delivered in February of 2001. This was the second semi-submersible rig constructed of a class of 2, Deepwater Nautilus being its predecessor. The rig was 396 by 256 feet and capable of operating in waters up to 8,000 feet deep, with a maximum drill depth of 30,000 feet. Various advanced systems played a key role in the rig's operation, from pressure and drill monitoring technology to automated shutoff systems and modeling systems for cementing. The rig was leased to BP on a not one, not two, but 3-year contract for deployment in the Gulf of Mexico, following Icarus and Thunder Horse oil fields. It was described at times as a lucky and celebrated rig, and in 2007 was still described as one of the most powerful rigs in the entire world. In 2006, it discovered oil in the Casquita oil field, and in 2009, the giant Tiber oil field. The well in the Tiber field had a true vertical depth of 35,050 feet below 4,132 feet of water. So I know that might sound a little confusing, but I want to make it really clear. And I'm going to try to put in visuals throughout this video if possible. But what that's saying is that it's accounting for the amount of water, the depth of the water, right? Which is over 4,000 feet vertically downwards, and then 35,000 additional feet below the seabed, so into the sediment, into the rock, to get to the oil field. So just wanted to be clear about that. There's a lot of numbers that are going to get thrown around. I'm going to try to make it as clear and consumable as possible. Okay, this well, located approximately 250 miles southeast of Houston, became known as the deepest oil well in the entire world. And if you noticed the math, it's more than 5,000 feet farther below the seabed than the rig's official drilling specification. So again, the maximum drill depth for the Deepwater Horizon was listed at 30,000 feet. This particular well was found at 35,000 feet. So incredibly deep, right? So, in February 2010, the Deepwater Horizon began drilling an exploratory well at the Macondo Prospect, more formally known as the Mississippi Canyon Block 252. This is roughly 41 miles off the southeast coast of Louisiana. The well was located approximately 18,000 feet into the rock, above 5,000 vertical feet of ocean water. So a little shallower of a well than the last one that we talked about, right? The Macondo Prospect exploration rights had been acquired by BP in 2009, with the prospect jointly owned by Anadarko Petroleum and Moex Offshore 2007. 2 months later, in April, exploratory work had been described as concluded, with permission already having been requested to terminate operations at the Macondo site. They were like, we're done here, let's wrap it up, let's all go home. The rig was scheduled to move to its next roles as semi-permanent production platforms, initially at the Tiber site that we mentioned, followed by a return to the Casquita field, an oil dome 50 miles off the coast of Louisiana, so both in relatively close proximity. However, at 9:38 p.m. on April 20th, 2010, something truly terrible happened. During this time, the first hydrocarbons, which are a mixture of oil and gas, passed through the Deepwater Horizon's 5-story blowout preventer. Resting on the seabed, the blowout preventer was an elaborate fail-safe device that gave the drilling crew several ways to seal the well. But once oil and gas got past the blowout preventer, there was nothing to stop material from racing up the Deepwater Horizon's riser pipe, which is essentially a 5,000-foot umbilical cord to the rig. So unfortunately, because this happened, what soon followed was the eruption of a slushy combination of drilling mud, methane, gas, and water. The gas component of the slushy material quickly transitioned into a fully gaseous state, which ignited series of explosions, creating this deadly firestorm. An attempt was made to activate the blowout preventer, but by this time it had failed. The final defense to prevent an oil spill in this case, a device known as a blind shear ram, was also activated, but as well, it failed to plug the well. So, I'm now going to share an excerpt about those troubling moments from a 2010 New York Times article titled "The Deepwater Horizon's Final Hours." And just be advised, it's a little bit graphic and it's terribly sad. So just putting that warning out there for anybody listening right now. Quote, "Crew members were cut down by shrapnel, hurled across rooms, and buried under smoking wreckage. Some were swallowed by fireballs that raced through the oil rig's shattered interior. Dazed and battered survivors, half naked and dripping in highly combustible gas, crawled inch by inch in pitch darkness, willing themselves to the lifeboat deck. However, it was no better there. That same explosion had ignited a firestorm that enveloped the rig's derrick. Searing heat baked the lifeboat deck. Crew members, certain that they were about to be cooked alive, scrambled into enclosed lifeboats for shelter, only to find them like smoke-filled ovens. Men admired for their toughness, wept. Several said their prayers and jumped into the oily seas 60 feet below. An overwhelmed young crew member by the name of Andrea Fleites finally screamed what so many were thinking: "We are going to die." So, to reiterate, crew members died and suffered terrible injuries because every one of the Deepwater Horizon's defenses failed in those moments. In addition, at critical moments that night, members of the crew hesitated and did not take the decisive steps that were needed. Communications completely fell apart, warning signs were missed, and crew members in critical areas failed to coordinate any kind of response. So for 9 very long, very precious minutes, as the drilling crew battled the blowout and gas alarms eventually sounded on the bridge, there was no warning given to the rest of the crew. For many, the very first hint of crisis came in the form of a blast wave. So the rig was eventually evacuated, with injured workers airlifted to medical facilities. After approximately 36 hours, the Deepwater Horizon sank on April 22nd, 2010. The remains of the rig were located resting on the seafloor, approximately 4,921 feet deep and about 1,312 feet northwest of the well. So before digging into more of why this happened, and many more things to be discussed on this, I do want to pause and share my very most heartfelt sympathies for the lives that were lost during this tragedy, as well as to the families of the loved ones who have really, really suffered an incredible amount up until this point. So, the names of those who have been lost include the following: Jason Anderson, 35, of Midfield, Texas. Donald Clark, 49, of Newellton, Louisiana. Stephen Ray Curtis, 40, of Georgetown, Louisiana. Gordon Jones, 28, of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Roy Wyatt Kemp, 27, of Jonesville, Louisiana. Carl Kleppinger Jr., 38, of Natchez, Mississippi. Keith Blair Manuel, 56, of Gonzales, Louisiana. Dewey Rivette, 48, of State Line, Mississippi. Shane Roshto, 22, of Liberty, Mississippi. And Adam Weiss, 24, of Yorktown, Texas. Those were the 10 workers who were presumed killed in the initial explosion. However, there was an 11th death of crane operator Aaron Dale Burkeen, 37, of Philadelphia, Mississippi, who died in the subsequent fire. So of those 11, none of the bodies have ever been recovered. So, how could something like this happen? Well, on the early evening of April 20th, there was one crucial test remaining before the Deepwater Horizon could plug the Macondo site and move on to the next. But to make sure that the well was not leaking, the crew would withdraw heavy mud from it and replace it with lighter seawater. They would then shut in the well to see if the pressure would build up inside of it. If it did, that could mean that the hydrocarbons, which again is a combination of oil and gas, were seeping into the well. So in effect, what they were doing here was willing the well to blow out. It was a test to see essentially if something bad was going to happen, right? And the designing, interpreting of this test, known as a negative pressure test, requires this sort of blend of art and engineering, right? There's actually no industry standards or government rules for the test. It really fell onto BP company men and drilling crew to work out the details. But needless to say, this negative pressure test, which again was done to try to rule out any possible bad things from happening, the test did not go well. And so there ended up being a really strong disagreement over the test results. Pressure had built up, which is exactly what they did not want. And Mr. Wheeler, the team's tool pusher, was worried, right? He was concerned about this. A BP company man said that he thought the test was fine. Other rig managers, including a man named Mr. Anderson, joined the discussion, and they debated whether or not to repeat the test, which they did eventually decide to do. So, by 8 p.m., after completing another negative pressure test, they all agreed that the Macondo site was stable. In a few hours, the drilling crew's 21-day hitch would be complete. But there's always a but. They were working unusually fast. Many jobs were going on at the same time, from transferring mud to a supply vessel, to cleaning mud pits, to repairing a pump. All of these efforts, especially happening simultaneously, could throw off really crucial instruments. So, preparing to plug the well, the drilling crew was pumping mud from it, reducing the weight bearing down on the hydrocarbons. Investigators here agreed that the Macondo had in fact failed its crucial final test. They have pointed to BP's cursory instructions and questioned whether the Horizon's crew had the skills to correctly interpret the results. They also believe that monitors should have allowed the team to spot the signs of leaking within the first 20 minutes that it had occurred. So whether the team was distracted by other tasks, rushing to get things done, or simply just being complacent is completely unclear. Quote, "The question is why these experienced men out on that rig talked themselves into believing that this was a good test," said Sean Grimsley, a lawyer for the Presidential Commission investigating the disaster. So because of that failed pressure So that's what led to the complete devastation and disaster that I just read about. So of course, this is already tremendously bad, but it really is just the beginning of a very long trail of devastation. So we're gonna get more into that now as well. So to be clear, what has gone on was an essential geyser of hydrocarbons, right? The oil and gas that was escaping. And because the oil rig sank, that oil continued to flow out into the ocean. Devastating. And oil would continue to discharge into the Gulf until July 15th, a total of 87 days, when a capping stack was finally successfully installed to stop the release of that oil. The volume of oil escaping the damaged well, originally estimated by BP to be about 1,000 barrels per day, was thought by U.S. government officials to have peaked at more than 60,000 barrels per day. In total, an estimated 134 million gallons of oil was released into the ocean. I'm going to say that one more time. In total, an estimated 134 million gallons of oil was released into the ocean. Shortly after the capping stack was installed, relief wells were used to permanently seal the well, which was declared effectively dead on September 19th, 2010. However, several research groups claimed that subsurface plumes of dispersed hydrocarbons had been detected in May, which was 8 months after that declaration. These claims were initially dismissed by BP and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, also known as NOAA. However, it was verified in June that the plumes were in fact from the Deepwater Horizon spill. So despite them saying that it was a completely dead well, that there was no more oil being released, they did still find those plumes after the fact, and it was verified. So the effect of microscopic oil droplets on the ecosystem at this time was unknown, though their presence, along with that of a layer of oil several inches thick, discovered on portions of seafloor in September, cast doubt on earlier predictions about the speed with which the discharged oil would dissipate. But again, the impacts of that disaster would very soon come to light. There were a lot of question marks at this time, but shortly after it became very obvious as to what was going on. So, a bit of information about those impacts. The petroleum that had leaked from the well before it was sealed formed a slick extending more than 57,500 square miles of the Gulf of Mexico. To clean oil from the open water, 1.8 million gallons of dispersants, which are known as substances that emulsify the oil, which essentially allows for easier metabolism by bacteria, the bacteria that sort of consume it, that was pumped directly into the leak and also applied airily into the slick. Booms to corral portions of the slick were also deployed, and the contained oil was then siphoned off or burned. As oil began to contaminate Louisiana beaches in May, it was manually removed. More difficult to clean were the state's marshes and estuaries, where the topography was knit together by delicate plant life. Now, by June, oil and tar balls had made landfall on the stretches of Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. In all, an estimated 1,300 miles of shoreline across Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and Florida were all polluted. The surface oil slick totaled 43,300 square miles, which is approximately equal to the size of Virginia, the entire state of Virginia. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill is cited by lawyers, academics, and journalists as an example of ecocide, and here's why. Thousands of birds, mammals, and sea turtles were plastered with leaked oil. A December 2013 study of living dolphins in Barataria Bay, Louisiana, found that roughly half were extremely sick. Many suffered from lung and adrenal disorders known to be linked to oil exposure. 1,400 whales and dolphins had been found stranded by the end of 2015, a figure representing only a small percentage of the animals affected. Though the number of dead animals had begun to taper off, substantial decreases in dolphin fertility persisted. It was thought that the strandings represented the largest mortality event ever to occur in the Gulf of Mexico. Birds were particularly vulnerable to the oil's effects, and many perished from ingesting oil as they tried to clean themselves, or because the substance on them interfered with their ability to regulate their own body temperatures. The brown pelican, in particular, recently delisted as an endangered species, was among the species most affected. A 2014 study projected that perhaps 12% of the brown pelicans and more than 30% of laughing gulls in the area hit by the spill had been completely wiped out. According to another 2014 study, up to 800,000 birds were thought to have died. Even those that were not directly contaminated by the oil were still affected. A 2012 study determined that white pelicans that had migrated from the Gulf to Minnesota to breed were producing eggs that contained discernible amounts of compounds that were actually traceable to the BP oil spill. Eggs containing traces of contaminants were found in Iowa and Illinois as well. Now, the animals that were found alive in the wake of the spill were transported to rehabilitation centers and, after being cleaned and medically evaluated, were released into oil-free zones. Now, deep breath if this is a lot. I know this is particularly terrible to hear. It's terrible to read as well, but I want to get all of the information out there. So we are going to get through it together. Moving on. Concerns about the offspring of sea turtles that nested on the Gulf coasts of Alabama and Florida led wildlife officials to dig up thousands of eggs and hatch them in a warehouse for later release into the Atlantic coast. By late 2012, 1,700 turtles had been found dead. A long-term satellite tracking study released in May 2013 showed that the endangered Kemp's Ridley sea turtle was likely severely affected, as its preferred foraging territory was within an area damaged by the spill. It was estimated that up to 65,000 imperiled turtles had died during 2010 alone, mostly as a result of the contamination. It was also estimated that 300,000 turtles, some of which were originally from breeding populations in other parts of the world, were in the region of the spill when it occurred, leading scientists to point out the global impact essentially dead zones. Many sedentary organisms had suffocated or been sickened by the material, and most mobile organisms had fled. Reefs outside of a 12-mile radius from the Deepwater Horizon well appeared largely unaffected, thankfully, but those within that radius were heavily stressed. Lab studies suggested that oil and dispersants made coral reproduction more difficult. Coral larvae, which are initially mobile, attached to mature corals at much reduced rates following exposure to these substances. Tests also determined that oil and dispersants were fatal to rotifers, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that one, which are microorganisms that are crucial to the Gulf food web. And an April 2014 mission conducted by the research group Ecosystem Impacts of Oil and Gas Inputs to the Gulf, another mouthful, the abbreviation is ECOGIG, ECOGIG, aboard the submersible Alvin, which had famously been involved in investigating the wreckage of the Titanic, noted some ecological recovery of oiled areas of the seafloor, though detectable oil levels in sediment cores remained the same as they had been 4 years earlier. So not a whole lot of progression there. Okay. Various cleanup efforts were coordinated by the National Response Team, a group of government agencies headed by the U.S. Coast Guard and the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. BP, Transocean, and several other companies were held liable for the billions of dollars in costs accrued. We will get into the legal ramifications in just a bit. I just want to sort of wrap up this portion of impacts first. Like I said, I took a lot of notes. More than a third of federal waters in the Gulf were closed to fishing at the peak of the spill due to fears of contamination. A moratorium on offshore drilling enacted by U.S. President Barack Obama's administration left an estimated 8,000 to 12,000 individuals temporarily unemployed. And in addition, very few travelers were willing to face the prospects of petroleum-sullied beaches, leaving those dependent on tourism struggling to supplement their incomes. Following demands by Obama, BP created a $20 billion compensation fund for those affected by the spill. A year later, nearly a third of the fund had been paid out, though lack of oversight allowed government entities to submit wildly inflated claims, some completely unrelated to the spill. And by 2013, the fund was largely depleted. Recovery was extremely incremental. As oil dispersed, portions of the Gulf began reopening to fishing in July, and by October, the majority of the closed areas were then deemed safe. State governments struggled to draw attention to unsoiled or newly scrubbed beaches with advertising campaigns, which often drew on funds from BP. Oil continued to wash ashore in many areas, and much of it would not be removed either because of logistical reasons or because cleaning it up would inflict greater harm on the ecosystem. But Coast Guard cleanup patrols ultimately drew to a close in Alabama, Florida, and Mississippi in June 2023, and in Louisiana in April 2014. So, getting back now to legal ramifications, I want to start by mentioning that Transocean received an early partial insurance settlement for total loss of the Deepwater Horizon of $401 million around May 5th, 2010. Now, financial analysts noted that the insurance recovery was likely to outweigh away the value of the rig, although not necessarily its replacement value in any liabilities. But basically, they were saying that the value of the insurance payout would far exceed the actual value of the rig. A formal civil and criminal investigation into the spill was initiated in June 2010 by the U.S. Department of Justice, or DOJ. In August, Louisiana District Court Judge Carl Barbier was appointed to oversee the consolidated proceedings relating to the spill, which had prompted numerous lawsuits and precipitated a morass of complex legal entanglements, both private and public. The DOJ sued BP, Transocean, and Anadarko in New Orleans civil court in December for violating the Clean Water Act and Oil Pollution Act. A July 2010 analysis by the Financial Times on the aftermath cited legal sources as saying that, quote, at some point the scale of the litigation becomes so large that it really is novel, that the situation is likely to be complicated further because of the variety of probable cases means it will be hard to aggregate them into so-called class actions, unquote, and that there was no way to put this into historical context because nothing like that had ever been faced before. As with the Exxon Valdez disaster, litigation was being discussed in terms of a 20-year timescale. Now, a report released in September by the Joint Investigation Team of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, Regulation, and Enforcement, and the U.S. Coast Guard emphasized BP's ultimate responsibility for the disaster. The report noted that although the defective concrete cap had been installed by Halliburton, decisions about the installation process made by BP had been the actual cause of failure. The investigation further found that BP and Transocean employees aboard the rig had, while engaged in testing procedures, ignored early indications of a problem and thus missed opportunities to prevent a full-scale blowout. Though representatives of BP conceded that the company was responsible for some of the factors contributing to the spill, they stressed that their partner companies were also to blame. Halliburton and Transocean similarly pointed to failures on the part of the other parties involved. So things were not looking good for these companies, and the emergence of BP chief executive Tony Hayward as the public face of this oil giant further inflamed public sentiment against the company. At one point, Hayward remarked, quote, "I'd like my life back," unquote. He was replaced shortly after that, in October. By the next year, the company had lost almost a quarter of its market value and had hemorrhaged over $40 billion in costs associated with both cleanup and recovery. In early March 2012, BP agreed to settle claims made by the Plaintiffs' Steering Committee, the consolidated representative body for many of the individual victims of the spill, for at least $7.8 billion. In addition to covering economic losses sustained in the wake of the spill, the settlement mandated the payment of medical claims, which had previously been denied by the fund, and provided for 21 years of further medical monitoring and care, allowing for the delayed onset of symptoms and illnesses. But remember that, because we're going to come back to it later. In November 2012, BP reached an agreement with the DOJ to plead guilty to 14 criminal charges, among them 11 counts of felony manslaughter and violations of the Clean Water and Migratory Bird Treaty Acts. The agreement carried penalties and fines amounting to more than $4.5 billion, of which nearly $1.26 billion would go to a discretionary fund overseen by the DOJ, $2.4 billion to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and $350 million to the National Academy of Sciences. BP also agreed to pay more than $500 million to the Securities and Exchange Commission for misleading its shareholders about the magnitude of the oil spill. The deal was approved in January of 2013. In addition, the EPA suspended BP from entering into any new federal contracts. That suspension, initially thought to be temporary, was reinforced in January of 2013. It was not lifted until March 2014. Of course, this was not just about BP. And in January 2013, Transocean agreed to pay $1.4 billion for violations of the U.S. Clean Water Act. Approximately $800 million of that amount was earmarked for restoration projects in the Gulf, and the remainder was paid to the federal government. In September 2014, Halliburton agreed to settle a large percentage of legal claims against them by paying $1.1 billion into a trust. These funds included a $200,000 penalty after pleading guilty to criminal charges, saying that its employees had destroyed evidence related to the spill. On September 4th, 2014, U.S. District Judge Carl Barbier ruled BP guilty of gross negligence and willful misconduct under the Clean Water Act. He described BP's actions as reckless, while he said Transocean's and Halliburton's actions were negligent. He apportioned 67% of the blame for the spill to BP, 30% to Transocean, and 3% to Halliburton. BP issued a statement strongly disagreeing with this finding. Of course they did. And in November 2015, Anadarko was judged liable for $159.5 million in civil penalties for its minor but still significant role in the disaster. There were charges against 4 BP employees. Kurt Mix, a former senior drilling engineer who had worked for BP until January 2012, was charged in federal court with obstructing justice for deleting hundreds of text messages concerning the flow rate of oil, despite having received legal notification to preserve the correspondence. 2 senior officers on the Deepwater Horizon oil rig, Robert Calusa and Donald Vidrine, were charged with manslaughter. David Rainey, the former vice president for exploration in the Gulf of Mexico, was charged with obstructing Congress and making false statements to law enforcement concerning the rate at which oil was leaking from the rig. Now, to the dismay of many observers, none of the individuals who were charged with criminal offenses related to the spill ultimately received any prison sentences. Nothing. Rainey was acquitted in June 2015. Mix was granted a retrial owing to juror misconduct and instead pled guilty to misdemeanor computer fraud charges. He was sentenced to probation and community service in November 2015. The manslaughter charges against Calusa and Vidrine were dropped in December 2015 at the request of the prosecution. Vidrine pled guilty to a misdemeanor charge of pollution under the Clean Water Act, and in April 2016 was sentenced to probation, community service, and the payment of a fine. Calusa pled not guilty at the same charge and was completely cleared, in February 2016. So nothing happened to any of them, really. Now, in 2020 and 2020 and 2020, 10 years after the disaster, the former members of the National Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill and offshore drilling noted that the U.S. Congress had failed to act on most of the recommendations in the final report. As drilling moves farther offshore and deeper underwater, they said, another spill of equally disastrous proportions is possible. All 7 members, in fact, agreed that the United States response was only marginally better prepared than it was for the night of April 20th, 2010. Every member of the bipartisan panel, the National Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill and offshore drilling, accused the Trump administration of putting American waters, coastlines, and wildlife in harm's way by weakening safety and environmental regulations while pushing to expand oil drilling in nearly all American waters. They also accused Congress of a near-complete failure to adopt the recommendations on drilling safety. Only the oil industry, ironically enough, earned high marks from the commissioners, who credited companies with making substantial improvements in well containment capabilities over the decade. Meanwhile, a study published in the journal Nature in 2020 found that fish in the Gulf of Mexico continued to show evidence of contamination by polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and Louisiana's coastal marsh soils showed high levels of oil contamination compared to pre-spill levels. Now, the spill cost Louisiana about 22,000 jobs, according to a CPRA report. Those who worked to clean the oil and lived in the immediate area also suffered health problems: shortness of breath, headaches, chronic cough, dizzy spells, and chest pain were some of the many symptoms reported by those exposed to the spill, even decades after the disaster. Through the settlement, BP has paid ill workers and coastal residents $67 billion. The vast majority, however, 79%, have received no more than $1,300 each. Many workers claiming illnesses from the spill were forced to sue, and they've fared worse because of it. All but a handful of roughly 4,800 lawsuits seeking compensation for health problems have been dismissed. The repeated failures demonstrate how extremely difficult it is to prove to a court that a specific illness is caused by chemical exposure, even when those chemicals are recognized causes of illness more generally. CPRA's report also discussed how the spill affected Louisiana's Gulf towns socially and psychologically. Communities who have experienced great trauma, like hurricanes, flooding, and in this case, oil spills, are more vulnerable to the effects of future disasters. April 20 may pass for many as a day indistinct from others, but even 14 years later, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill continues to influence the ecosystems, economies, and people of and surrounding Louisiana. So that is the story that I have to share with you today. And I just want to say that it has been cut immeasurably from my original notes. There is so much that goes into this story, and I highly recommend, if you're interested, checking it out. There are also many specifics to the story that I didn't feel were necessarily useful for a more general video, and also went beyond my level of understanding as well, because in no way am I an engineer. Not at all. So if you really want to get into like the nuts and bolts, there are a lot of great resources out there for you. I pulled my information, my notes from various sources, in particular Britannia, the New York Times, Wikipedia even, and lots of local news outlets, especially regarding like the 10-year follow-ups and the articles that were posted a few days ago for the 14th anniversary. So I did a lot of cross-referencing there, but each site, each source offered something a little bit different as well. So again, highly recommend looking into it for yourselves if you would like. And I also highly recommend the film Deepwater Horizon. It came out in 2016 and it features Mark Wahlberg. He's like one of the main characters in the film, and say either Hulu or Max, HBO Max. But certainly worth the watch. It's a very accurate depiction from what I've read and what I've seen, and just really well and tastefully done. And I think can create a much more impactful visual than the one that I have provided through these notes, right? Film just has a way of doing that, but again, because the anniversary was so recent, I did want to make a video on this and felt it was important. It's really just like horrifying in so many ways to me. The loss of life, the environmental devastation, the way it has affected communities and livelihoods. Still to this day, I mean, the ramifications are boundless and go off into so many different directions. The more I read through this, the more upsetting it was. And I remember when this first happened, I was maybe 15, and I knew none of this background, none of this story, really. I just knew there was something called the BP oil spill, and it, was really bad for the ocean. That's what I knew. I didn't know any of this. Granted, I didn't look into it, but I've learned it all now, finally. So, again, I felt it would make for a good video. I know many of you have requested more sort of true crime videos from me. I know this isn't quite that, but I do have one in the queue that is definitely more like true crime. It's actually exactly true crime, but I feel like this touches on some of those elements with like big corporations and mishandling of situations leading to, wrongful deaths and what have you. So anyway, I will leave it at that. I'm hoping that my voice and breathing and stuffy nose and sore throat and all of that, again, wasn't too bothersome. I won't know until I go to edit this video to know exactly what it sounded like, so fingers crossed it's okay. But of course, I have to get my weekly video up, right? So I can't miss out on that. And the last thing I will say is I know that many of you are hoping that I can post more than once a week, and I want you to know that is also my hope. It's not something I've been able to do recently, but it is a goal that I have. I would like to at least do 2 a week at some point, but I'm just not able to right now. Anyways, I will be back so soon with another video. I thank you so much for watching and hanging out with me tonight. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, week, month, what have you. And let me know what you thought of the video and what you would like to see more of. I have some requests pending. I know I'm gonna get to them, I promise, but of course feel free to